Hi, everyone. Welcome to the call. We're going to get started in a couple minutes. If you just want to make sure that your line is muted, that would be great, and we will kick off here in a couple minutes.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. This is Terry McCann. I'm the president of the Iowa Council of Foundations, and we are at 11:30, so we'll go ahead and get started with our webinar. Michelle, I'll ask you to go ahead and start recording the webinar on your end as I do a few housekeeping items. We are using the ReadyTalk platform today for our webinar, and we also have audio available, so folks are calling in on their phones. So please keep your phones on mute throughout the webinar today. We will be able to use the chat function in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen if you have a question. And you can submit questions for our presenter today. And we also have a guest speaker from an affiliate foundation who will be sharing some information with you. So feel free to submit questions for her as well. This is the first part of a two-part webinar series for the summer that the Iowa Council of Foundations is hosting in support of the Iowa Community Foundations Initiative. And we've heard a lot of feedback from host and affiliate foundations about needing some best practices and information on effective advisory committee best practices for your work in your counties and in your communities. So we are really excited to welcome Tony Macklin today. On the next slide here, you'll see a picture of Tony. And Tony has experience working in Indiana at Community Foundations there, and I'll let him tell you more about himself as we get started. But just a wealth of knowledge, so really excited to have him. And he'll also be presenting our second webinar and joining us at the Connect conference this year. So we'll hear from him a lot in the next couple months. And our other speaker today is Betty Bowler, and Betty is the Development Director of the Marshall County Community Foundation, which is an affiliate of the Community Foundation of Greater Des Moines. So she'll share a strategy and best practice with you as well as we get further into our webinar. So those are our housekeeping items. Just again, a reminder to keep your line muted if you aren't speaking, and use that chat function in the bottom left-hand corner of your webinar screen there. And I will go ahead and kick things over to Tony.
Thanks very much, and welcome everybody to this first webinar. We're first time with this technology, so that we've got everything running, but feel free to pop your questions in along the way. So I'm Tony Macklin. I grew up in a small town in Indiana, worked for state government, then worked for the Community Foundation in Indianapolis, Indiana for 12 years, managed a family foundation for 4 years, and then have been doing consulting for a variety of foundations and donor families and for a number of the peer associations to ICOF. So the Association in Indiana and Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and a couple others. So it's been fun to get back into the field and see what all the community foundations have been up to recently. So today's topic, we use the word board, and I want to be clear that not all of you are serving on official nonprofit boards. You might be called an affiliate governing body, affiliate committee, affiliate host committee, whatever the case may be. But most of what we're talking about today in terms of governance and stewardship and effective volunteer engagement practices fit whether you have a formal board role or it's more of an advisory committee role. So if you don't have a legal and tax status on your own, that means the host takes care of those things. The rest of this governance stuff we'll cover with you. So we'll use the board just because it's shorthand rather than saying a bunch of other terms all at the same time. 4 things to cover today. We're going to talk about the big picture of stewarding a community foundation. We'll talk about the core responsibilities of board members, talk about how you build an effective culture and engage boards and what that looks and feels like, and Betty's got some good examples to bring into that. And then we'll end with recruitment and orientation and self-evaluation tips, and we'll grab some of your questions, and hopefully you might have some tips that you want to share along the way as well, and we'll add those in. We'll have the second of this 2-part webinar on August 10th, and that's going to be focused on your board members as resource builders. We'll talk about a great model called the AAA approach to building a culture of philanthropy. We'll look at the different types of capital and assets that a foundation brings in, not just the financial, but the rest of it, and we'll key into that a little bit today. Talk about board responsibilities and resource development and community engagement, and then Carrie will swing in and talk about some of the resource development strategies and connections that you make with the Endow Iowa and county endowment programs. So you get a 2-part on this. This will be recorded, so if your board members miss this, you want to show it to them later, Iowa Capital Foundations will make that available, and the August 10th one will be recorded later as well. One other note, many of the slides today are courtesy of the Indiana Philanthropy Alliance's Community Foundations Boot Camp. You all had that in Iowa last year, might have again in the next year or the following. And the Indiana folks were kind enough to loan us some of the curricular materials for these 2 webinars, and I've been one of the trainers on their boot camp. So with that, let's jump in to the subject today. This definition of community foundation should not be foreign to you. It comes from the national standards for community foundations. It's the one that all of the hosts learn about when they're training their own board members and staff, and the one that they could be passing on to you. And it has that classic 3-part piece of what board members should be tracking in their community foundations or their affiliate community foundations: building funds, supporting a broad-based set of interests, and then serving in leadership roles on important community issues. I should also say that you'll be getting these slides shortly after the webinar in PDF form, so you can refer back to them. Some of them are text heavy, so don't expect that you have to write all of the notes. I'm going to refer to some of the text on them and bounce off of them in terms of some of the ideas that are on them. The other great thing that the folks in Indiana did for the boot camp was come up with this chart. They tried to capture all of what a community foundation does in one really big picture. And the Indiana folks and I have found that this chart's a great sort of 1-page visual as you're bringing new board members on, or as you're referring back to what are your responsibilities across the whole year. One of the community foundations, small community foundations in Indiana, rural one, talked about using those vertical columns, the donors and gifts are placed into a fund, as sort of their continual training program. And so every time the board met, they'd have their normal board meeting stuff, but they'd also have like a 15-minute education component. And the executive director in that case, the 1-person shop, would take some ideas out of this and talk about what it means to do donor development or gift development. And so you might think about that in terms of your own ongoing training program of using these different strategies. And again, you'll get this in the PDF later, and you can feel free to share it with board members and prospective board members. In the community foundation world, in the 100+ years we've been around, the term stewardship keeps coming up because we are stewards of long-term assets. As one of my former bosses said, Ken Gladish, we are just temporary stewards of an extraordinary community asset. And it was always a good reminder that no matter how long, endowment's a really long time when you're building an endowment. And so even if you're in the organization for 10 years or 20 years, you're still just a small blip in a long-term trajectory. And it sort of brings good humility and good honor to what you're doing. Stewardship has a lot of different definitions. This is one that's common in the Community Foundation field. Responsible management and protection of something considered worth caring for and preserving. And what are we stewarding? Actually, I should have changed the bullets on this. The more I've been thinking about this, we're stewarding finances, obviously. We're stewarding a grant-making process. But I think you're also stewarding relationships with all different kinds of people. So it's not just donors. Your board, your advisory committee has responsibilities for stewarding all of the other, as some people would call it, human assets or talent that you have. So it's stewarding great relationships internally with your board members and any staff or consultants you might have. It's stewarding your relationships with other committee members and with other organizations in the community. So I think you can talk about stewardship internally as more than a financial thing. It's really all of these other human assets that you have that are attached to the organization. This slide shouldn't be a surprise for if you've served on other nonprofit boards before. And again, it's incorporated into a lot of nonprofit law or governance practices, but I think the spirit of it is captured well for other advisory committees that have a leadership role in the community. It's the 3 duties, and that's something that lawyers talk a lot about or other nonprofit professionals talk about. And so you have this duty of care to ensure prudent use of assets, financial, human, all the rest of them, goodwill of the organization, and ensure the effectiveness and sustainability of an organization or an affiliate in your case. One of the cautions that I often talk about with organizations is sometimes people interpret ensure prudent use of assets as meaning we should never take any risk. And I think the modern day version of that is really drawn partly from investment standards, what are prudent investor standards, but even then when people talk about what's prudent use of a foundation or a nonprofit's resources, it's about what would smart people do and how would they assess risk in modern smart ways. So it's not about no risk or very, very little risk. It's about thinking through what risks you have, whether it's financial or grant making or leadership or the rest, and talking that out and seeing what are the pros and cons of them. And some people, so it's just sort of a caution. Some people sort of overemphasize the prudentness of that. Duty of loyalty is one of the hardest things to manage, especially in rural community foundations or rural affiliates, because this is not only conflict of interest, the legal definitions of are you acting in the best interest from a legal and tax standpoint of an organization, but it's also the duty of loyalty, that perception issue of I'm on the board of 2 other organizations and on the board of the community foundation, or I have a law firm that does estate planning and I'm on the board of the community foundation. And what are the perceptions of what your interactions are between those 2 roles? More and more nonprofits and maybe perhaps more and more of your affiliates have been outlining not only conflict of interest responsibilities and documents which are required by the IRS and probably with your host organization, but extending those to be sort of a conflict of loyalty document. So even if it's not a fiduciary conflict of interest, it really relates down to my kid's on this school board, my wife is involved in this thing, and even though there's no technical conflict of interest, we want to be clear and transparent about what those relationships look like so that the Community Foundation can go back and say we know where all these entanglements are and we're taking good care of them. And then the last one, duty of obedience, is pretty simple. Just so be legal and ethical and adhere to your mission and legal documents as they're developed. The other classic model for board responsibilities and board member responsibilities is from Board Source. And if you as an organization have not run into Board Source yet, they are a national nonprofit that produces amazingly helpful resources on being a board member. So you can use them internally, and more importantly, they're great resources for your grantees and your other nonprofit partners in the community. They have a bunch of things you can download for free, and a bunch of things that are like $5 or $10 a shot, and you can subscribe to some of the materials. Dave described these 10 basic board responsibilities. I know this has probably been around for 25 or 30 years, so hopefully this is not new to many of you. Most of these apply to affiliate organizations, even if they don't have their own legal and tax structures, because they're getting that through the host. So determining a mission, adequate financial resources, all the rest of the things that you can read. And there's a great sort of short document that you can hand to board members or hand to grantees that explains it a little farther, and it's really easy to read and absorb and understand. The ensure financial resources piece of this and the enhance the organization's public standing, those will be the thrust of the next session in August. The rest of this is a little bit more about what we're describing today. When the folks in Indiana did their boot camp back in Indiana a couple of years ago, and last year they were collecting, okay, board source says this stuff, and there's the legal stuff about what are board responsibilities, but what do you board members think about what does it mean to be an effective board member? And this was some of the phrases that came up when your peers attended a boot camp in Indiana. So, you know, they that's time in learning about the foundation. Ideally, they're reading the materials before the board and committee meetings. I've served on plenty of nonprofit boards, and I know, like probably the rest of you, I'm guilty of occasionally not getting to that stuff till the last minute. But in my best effective work, I try to get to it ahead of time and think about some questions. Actively participate in the meetings, actively create strong connections between the organization, your personal networks, and the community. And that's not just about fundraising, right? That's about all of the other connections of people where people see aligned interests and connected missions and the rest of it. Develop and practice key messages. Some people would call that an elevator pitch. Doesn't always work if you don't have an elevator in your city, and oftentimes an elevator pitch tends to be something that's directed at somebody versus key messages that can engage somebody in a dialogue. We'll talk about that a little bit in the next session as well. And then participate in board self-evaluations, and we'll come back to that at the end of this webinar. And so those are some ideas that came from your peers and other small and mid-sized community foundations. One of the big things that we want to talk about today is board engagement and board culture. So our third big topic today. There's a great magazine for people who are trustees of universities or other larger institutions. So the articles tilt to those kinds of things, but I think their concepts around trusteeship and stewardship and board membership are evergreen for any kind of organization. And one of the frequent authors of Trusteeship magazine said board culture is really about something that's intangible but an invaluable asset. So there's another kind of an asset that you're stewarding, not just the human and financial. It's this internal board culture. And it's worth the same level of attention as building the endowment or anything else. She goes on later in one of her articles to say the most visible board missteps in the nonprofit sector and in the corporate sector the past decade have been because boards haven't paid attention to that internal board culture, which drives ethics and duty to obedience and all of the rest of the things that we talked about before. And so I think it's a great way to talk about it internally, and this is an asset we have to manage. We've got a couple ideas on that here. The Bridgespan Group is one of the national consulting firms that works a lot with foundations of more large and mid-size, but as they were surveying their customers and watching what was working well, they came up with these 5 points about what does effective board leadership feel like. And they said it's beyond what you do, it's how you do it. And that's really then the board engagement strategies. And so this is about how board members support each other, the kinds of things that you're doing alongside of each other and supporting each other. And it's the same 5 points that staff or your staff members at a host foundation can think about in terms of what are they paying attention to in terms of how the conversations go at a board meeting. So do you have the right skills on the right tasks? Are the right people connected to the right things going on? A decade ago or more, there was the great book by Jim Collins, Good to Great. It's a business tome that also got put into the nonprofit sector, and he talked a lot about getting the right people on the bus, because it's about the talent first, and then you can figure out the tasks after that. It's about paying attention to culture. We talked about that earlier. Is you have to have a culture of open questioning, mutual trust. Do you have enjoyable interactions? You have to have fun at board meetings besides getting all the business done, right? Clear decision-making processes. Do you know how you're supposed to vote on things and when you need to engage people from the outside into that conversation, so everybody knows that when they get trained for the board and when they're in board meetings. Talk about the structures and policies, and those are things that you set up with your host foundation in most of your cases. Are they appropriate for the size and stage of your organization? So do you have simple things that you can manage if you're young, and then does it grow more complex as you get older along the way? And then do you have the right information? And I think this is something we're all learning a lot about in terms of how to get the right information to board members to make decisions. Having served a community foundation board and a family foundation board and worked alongside a couple other organizations that were reorganizing their board members, I think there were a couple of tips that I picked up on this clear, pertinent, and timely information piece. One is one nonprofit that I served on, the director or the staff members were really good at doing like a hit-me-quick summary page of what needed to happen and be discussed at the board meeting. So it's just like highlight quick paragraphs. And then there were deeper dive materials right behind that. Sometimes you just get this large packet of information and you want to wade through it. You're not sure what's most important. And so they took their own time to highlight what they thought was most important in the board packet or the set of materials before the board meeting. And the other thing that a board member trained me to do was to embed the most strategic questions into the agenda ahead of time and ask people to be thinking about them. So if you know in the August board meeting you've got to deal with governance or you've got to deal with finance or whatever the case is, and there's something coming up that's big, you put that question in front of folks ahead of time. It's just a small thing, but it gets people queued up for the right culture of open questioning and the right information at the right time. Especially for affiliates and for small organizations, a lot of the board culture piece falls on the board chair to pay attention to. One of your peers again in Indiana talked about in his small community foundation, he's the chief accountability officer for the board, chief accountability officer. So it was his job to make sure the board was on task, on mission, on legal, those three duties, they're things that were sort of running around in his mind. And so your board chairs might think of themselves in that particular role. And these were some of the things that came up in Indiana in terms of their community foundations, in terms of what's an effective board chair do as a team builder for the board. So a coach to the board, team builder, chief accountability officer, whatever phrase you like best. Makes the community foundation work a priority in life because that person is sort of a tag team, strategic thinker with staff members, if there are staff members. Sure, there is clear in vision and mission. You can see some of the other ones. And hopefully the board chair's got a great relationship with the host to trade ideas about here's what we're hearing in the community, here's the goals that we're thinking about, here's the questions we have about what comes next, and feeding back where the challenges are, like how we're running into the wall on finding talent around finance or whatever the case might be. The best board chairs spend a lot of time at the board meetings facilitating rather than talking. Even if there's something that they have to present, they're paying attention to everybody else being involved in the conversation and making sure that folks can get a voice in for whatever they might be interested in or what the topic is. And then there's a few more on the second slide. Again, you'll get all this in a PDF soon. One of the nonprofits that I was served on as a board, the board chair had thought about these kinds of things and actually split the function a little bit, and this might be something you can do, especially if you're mostly or all volunteer organizations. That particular board chair really took on the accountability piece, so the strategy and mission and the legal and ethics, but he had the vice president of the board, and then this carried on after both of them, really be the, again, as he called it, the chief culture officer. So somebody else was paying attention to, at the meetings, are people engaged? Are they checked out? Are they feeling ready for the meeting? They feel like they're contributing what makes sense for them to contribute, whether it's time, talent, treasure, all of those kinds of things. His vice president at the time was a pastor, so I think he was mentally sort of attuned to that kind of thing. But it might be something you could try as an official role for the vice chair of your board or vice chair of your committee or some other member who's good at that to just, watch the meetings going on and watch if people are falling off from attending and be the person who does that. Some organizations will have a formal governance committee that takes care of that. If you don't have a governance committee or a sort of a leadership committee or executive committee, then often a vice chair can take that role. Another organization that I talked with talked about this in terms of their talent committee and talent stewardship committee, and so it was their version of governance committee in terms of, do we have the right people on the right skill sets? Is everybody interacting in the right ways? Are we looking ahead to what we need next? And in their case, they had a couple staff members, and so they were also figuring out the staff management and reviews. And so you can either take it from a board chair responsibility, you can split it with your vice chair, you can have a small committee that really thinks about the talent flow that you have and how everybody's working together as a team. Another great book to recommend, besides Good to Great, if you hadn't caught that 10 or 12 years ago, is a book by Andy Stanley called Next Generation Leader. He came from a faith-based tradition or church tradition, but his ideas around leadership have resonated really well with a lot of other nonprofits. And this again came from the Indiana Philanthropy Alliance's boot camp. And he talks about an engaged board has these 5 C's. So this might work for you if this sort of 5C approach makes sense. Not everybody sort of resonates with it, but I thought it was worth putting in. And a great board, when they're fully engaged and they're really actively talking with each other, they've got clarity, they've got courage, they feel competent in what they're doing, they feel like they can learn more and be coached, and they're bringing good personal character to this. You could really use that as a board self-evaluation and sort of say, do I feel like we have courage as a board? Do I feel like I'm clear about what's going on? You could create a quick 5 or 6 questions around those 5 C's and check in with people and see how they're feeling about their engagement with the board and if they're able to offer what they want to the board. So the Next Generation Leader is a quick read and easy read, not an expensive book, well worth digging into if you're interested in learning more about that particular model. Again, we went back to the board members of some of your peers in Indiana, for instance, at the boot camps and said, how would you say the board feels engaged? And they came up with some of these phrases. I feel like I'm significant, like I'm not just sitting there not doing anything, and everybody else seems to feel the same way. We feel like we're a real community, a team. We're all sort of bouncing off each other in all of the right ways. I feel like other people feel like it's safe to learn and ask questions and engage in discussion. Nobody feels like they can't ask a question about what's going on or why something is going on. And that can be tricky. You have people who are really experienced on the board. Sometimes they're charging ahead on what a board needs to be doing, and the new folks feel like they can't say anything until they get ramped up a little while later. And then for those organizations that have staff more often, or even part-time staff more often, the board meetings switch to things that are more about vision, ideas and plans and operational issues. That's not always easy to do when you're an all-volunteer or a one-staffed organization, so that one may not apply to you. But if you're spending more time, at least, in the board meetings on the larger strategy and the larger culture and the larger connections in the community, you're at least in a good start, and even if you still have to do some operational issues along the way. One of the things that we talk a lot about with community foundations when I do consulting with them or when the Indiana does the boot camp around the country is making sure that you have time for fun at a board meeting. It's easy to get in a routine where it's all about knocking through the business items because you want to get an hour-long coffee done or meeting done or whatever the case may be. And it is a human endeavor, right? It's about people interacting with people, caring about something really crazy cool in the community. And so you want to build that fun in. I told a story Michelle and Carrie may have heard before, I sat in on a family foundations board meeting 4 years ago. They were thinking about hiring me to do some work, and they spent 6 hours together across the day. They had one really long board meeting a year, and hardly anybody cracked a smile. They were giving away close to $3 million across the country, but nobody seemed to be having fun with it. It just shocked me that you could somehow drum the fun out of giving away $3 million. And I'm hoping that's never happening to any of your boards, but it's a good reminder to sort of check in across a year. And are you building in time to play together, go out and have a drink together if that's your culture, go out and do something in a park together that's more active, whatever makes sense for your board, and it's okay to build that teamwork that way. So with that, I want to bring Betty on. If Betty can unmute, and she has a few engagement tips that she's been working on in Marshall County that maybe are good advice for you all.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. So thanks so much for this opportunity, Tony. It's fun to be able to present with you, and it's also always fun to talk about things that we do and that we think are kind of cool. So something that we've done that we think adds to our board engagement is to have board members serve as liaisons to our grant recipients. Came about because after one grant review meeting, I was surprised at the lack of awareness of the nonprofit world of some of our board members. You know, they come from all different types of areas in the community, and some of them are not very in tune to the nonprofits. And I could just tell that they weren't really connecting with the projects and the programs and some of the applications. So we thought if they could see firsthand some of the projects that we fund. I think one of the reasons people come onto a community foundation board is because they like the idea of being able to give money away. They like the idea of the grants. That's probably one of the, it's the most visible, and it's one of the things that attracts people to being on the board. And so, I think it's important that they really understand the projects and can feel proud of what we do. So we thought if they made a personal contact and had some firsthand experience with the projects or even just the nonprofit organization, it would help them learn more and better understand what we're doing. So each member has 2 or 3 grant recipients. We ask them to make an initial contact soon after the grant award ceremony. They offer to talk with the organization's board if they'd like that. They ask to be notified or invited to any special events that the organization might have throughout the year. And then they ask to visit the project if it's a project that you can actually go visit, or at least visit the organization that has received the grant. So the first time we did this, we had board members kind of choose which grant recipients they wanted to work with, and people tended to pick organizations that they already knew about. And so after that first time around, I actually assigned the grants to the board members so that we get them out of their comfort zone a little bit and they have an opportunity to see other things, because that's the whole point, is to learn more about what's going on in the community. Or sometimes I assign them to a recipient that maybe they weren't exactly enthused about during the grant review process, and that's been kind of interesting. In fact, one application that we had was from a child abuse prevention agency, and they were applying for laptops to use in their in-home parent education. Well, one of our board members was really not in favor of that. He just could not see the value of what they wanted to do and why we would want to fund that. And so he actually was assigned to be the liaison to that organization, and he embraced that. He was a good sport about it. He went to visit. I went with him on that visit, and they were able to, actually show him how they were using those in parent education, and he became a huge believer and probably one of the best advocates of that agency in the future. So that was one success story where he understood the value of the grant that we gave and kind of turned around his thinking. We've had really good feedback from recipients. I think one thing I've heard is that they appreciate that somebody's paying attention to them, that they don't just have to, submit a written report or an evaluation of their project, but that somebody is interested and cares enough to actually come and learn more about what they're doing, because they're proud of what they're doing as well. For the most part, the board members have been positive about it too. We have another board member who, when he came on the board, he was a city planner with the city of Marshalltown, and has told us that when he came on the board, he really thought he was going to be most interested in advocate for community development type programs, projects, more infrastructure type things. But after he visited a couple of the other projects that he was liaison to, and learned a lot about what the nonprofits do, he has a whole new appreciation for other programs, health care and education, and not just the community development things that he thought he was going to be interested in. So it helped him to learn more about the community in general, and had a much broader picture of the community foundation at that point. Sometimes, in fact, usually, I have to remind or encourage the board members to actually set up their visits, and sometimes I will even, set up a visit for them. And oftentimes I go with them simply because it's also a good learning opportunity for me to see what's happening with our dollars and take pictures and just give me a broader understanding as well. And then at each board meeting, we have an agenda item for board members to report on any visits that they've made. Not every month does somebody report, because there maybe hasn't been a visit, and then one month maybe we have 2 or 3 reports. But it's a good way then for them to be involved, be engaged in the meeting itself. They're kind of proud to tell about what they learned. The rest of the board learns more about a project that we've funded, and it gives us an opportunity to talk about if that project really does meet our mission, or if maybe we missed the mark ourselves in awarding that grant. And so it's sort of a form of evaluation as well, but I think more than anything, it's just been a good way for board members to sort of have another level of involvement.
Betty, I think this is Tony, that's terrific advice. People need to see things for their own eyes. Most of us, the older we get, even when we're young, we're experiential learners, right? We want to see things and touch things and hear things and talk with somebody about things. And no matter how well somebody writes a proposal, it's always better to see it in person. I heard a variation on this idea, and I can't remember which foundation it was now, but the Community Foundation also had a youth grant making committee. And so not only did their board members go do visits, they took one of those teenagers along, and inevitably the teenager was good at taking pictures with their cell phone and putting stuff up on the foundation's Facebook page or Instagram or something else. And so there's also a way to sort of get some quick pictures of how that interaction was going on and see the kids' faces. And so the board member and the teenager could bring that back to the board meeting along with whatever narrative or report they gave. And it was a nice sort of twist on the idea.
I like that.
One other question for you. Do you do anything to prep the organization for that board member's visit so it feels like it's a good use of both parties' time?
Oh, yeah, we do. Well, first of all, I notify the organization who their liaison is, and that they can be expecting a phone call or an email from them sometime. And then if I help to set up the visit for them, I do, explain to the organization why we're coming, what the board member might be interested in. It's worked out really well. I think, they have enough information to prepare. They know we're particularly interested in the project that they were funded for, but they also know that we're interested in their organization in general, and they can give us general information about what they do. So that's, we don't give them a lot of things that we want from them. It's certainly not like an audit or an accreditation or anything that formal, but they do get a heads up and kind of know what we would like to see.
Good. That's terrific advice. Well, I'll bring it back in later in the calls. We wrap up with a few more slides here. We got our first question in. Carrie had passed on a question about what are simple ambassador activities that committee members can do in their communities. So what's that ambassador role? And I'll say a little bit about that today, and that's definitely going to be a bigger topic on the August 10th webinar. But I think part of that ambassador role is having some assigned connections or with the community, whether it's certain sectors like human services or youth, or it's certain geographies, or it's certain kinds of people. I hope you can be the person who pays attention to all of the youth voices in the community or the senior citizens, whatever the case may be. And oftentimes board members bring their own list of contacts to be ambassadors with, the Rotary, the businesses that they're working with, Chamber of Commerce. But it's also nice for them to sort of be thinking about the community from someone else's perspective, walk the community in somebody else's shoes. And so their ambassador role is not only the extension of the Community Foundation's brand, but it's also bringing new voices and new perspectives back in. And I like the idea of the ambassador role is a two-way street of ideas, both stuff coming out. You want to do your 15-minute pitch for the Community Foundation somewhere, but also be able to listen and say, by the way, we've got 3 strategic questions we're asking everybody as ambassadors. What do you think what's your vision for progress in the community, or what is it that you think we're missing, and whatever those things are. And so you're in a two-way learning mode about it, probably the same way you're doing that Betty's doing that in her team with a microcosm of their grantees. So that's a quick ambassador tip. We'll talk more about that in the next session before as we talk about a AAA board, because ambassador is one of those AAAs of that particular board model. Let's jump in a little bit then to recruitment and orientation kinds of strategies, just to finish out getting the board engaged and on board in the right way, and then we'll come back to some more of your questions and any other perspectives from Betty. There's tons of materials out there from BoardSource, we mentioned before, and other places on board recruitment. Here were 4 tips that I've really picked up along the way. One is when you're out there thinking about who are the next class of advisory committee members, board members, any kind of committee members, it's really a conversation about mutual value proposition. Come at it from the business world. And it really is about that two-way street of, we need X amount of things from you in your leadership capacity with our organization, but we also want to make sure that we know what you want out of this connection. Is it a chance to be a voice for the community development industry? Is it a chance to learn more? Is it a chance to gain skills in being a good ambassador or a fundraiser, whatever the case may be, and you actually document that in the recruitment process? Some people talk about this in 4 capitals. It's the way some financial advisors think about the world, some of the higher end ones, or the 4 assets, some people call it. So some people would say time, talent, and treasure is one way to look for board members. Some people put it in this 4 capitals approach of, can they bring financial resources? Do they bring social connections? Do they bring intellectual knowledge, some kind of knowledge around something? And then do they have their own talents and time to give? And so some people would put a grid together to think about those 4 capitals if they don't want to do time, talent, treasure for whatever reason. The best organizations are really doing honest interviews ahead of time with the board to make sure that the board member knows what they're getting themselves into, or they'll do it in a group process, and that the sort of watchwords from best practices are transparent and selective in that process. An organization I was on the board of in Pittsburgh when I was there for a few years was really great at finding a class of prospective members of either the board or its committees. And they had an evening reception with all of those folks, as many of them who could attend. It was their chance to tour the building. It was a community center, learn about what the mission was. They got to meet some of the people who did programming in the building, and some of the people who were having their lives changed in the building. And most of us who were existing board members showed up and chatted with them about what our own experience was. And then after that, they got to have the individual conversations, say, yes, this really feels like a good use of my time, or this doesn't feel like a right fit for me, or I love what you're doing, but I don't have the time that you need for me to be a really effective board member. And so, again, it was that experiential learning for them before they signed on the dotted line. So you could create your own microcosm version of that if reception's a little fun and give people a chance to learn more about the organization before they sign up along the way. Board orientation, the folks in Indiana Philanthropy Alliance and the boot camp talk a lot about board orientation isn't just a one-time activity. Hopefully you're at least doing some orientation session when board members start or advisory committees start, and then it's a continuous process after that. And a couple more tips on the next slide. I actually meant to pull one of these out. So quality orientation is that ongoing set of briefings for new members and even for old members. Back to what we talked about toward the beginning of the presentation, there was that Community Foundation in one chart graphic, and some community foundations are using that as sort of an ongoing education process. You may have other ideas, or your host may have other ideas about, here's a quick 10 minutes on one other version of what community foundations do, so it's always fresh in your organization's mind, or your board members' mind. And community foundations are more complicated organizations to be board members of than other nonprofits. And even the smartest people and most connected people, and maybe Betty can weigh in later, still takes them a little while to understand the full range of what a community foundation does. It's a sort of a bigger agenda than a child care agency or an arts organization or something. So even with the best orientation and the best sort of cycling education in on all of the board meetings, it still may take a while for people to make sure they're comfortable connecting all the dots behind the scenes. And so I think that's why the continuous education makes it even more important. The other critical piece is on the ongoing piece and then on the back end for really having an effective, engaged board is that self-evaluation and self-assessment. If you do it on an annual basis at minimum, that's great. And I think some of the best ways that community foundations and affiliates have run these have really been an annual check-in to make sure that mutual value proposition that we talked about before is still in place, and to give people an easy out if it isn't. You'd rather have a bunch of people who are really enthused and dedicated than somebody who's on there because they feel like they have to be, but aren't all that emotionally engaged anymore. And so it's a great check-in point to say, is this still working for you? Is this still working for us? Are we meeting each other's expectations along the way? And a refresh on all the board responsibilities or advisory committee responsibilities, or whatever that checklist you have internally. And it can also be in a team building approach. You can do it in more of a retreat setting, or you can do it on a one-on-one kind of setting. Back to your peers from Indiana, some of the rural and mid-sized community foundations. We asked them what kinds of questions would you want in that kind of self-assessment process, and so they came up with some of these, and you can feel free to steal them and use them on your own. Some board chairs or staff members are using these in an orientation process. Some of them are using it in an annual self-evaluation process. Oftentimes, community foundations that have at least one staff member, that staff member may be doing one separate check-in conversation with each board member across the year, just a sort of a one-on-one coffee or lunch, and asks a lot of these same kinds of questions just to make sure the board member has a chance to think outside of whatever's on the agenda of the board meeting. So your board chair could do this, maybe your host staff could help with this, maybe you've assigned somebody like the vice chair to be sort of that board culture, board engagement kind of officer, and they can handle part of that, or you can split it up. Even people who've been around for a while, even people who are in leadership positions, you still need to ask these questions because oftentimes they get put themselves in a rut of I got to do this and this and this and this and this, and it's more about the tasks and not about is this still fun and right for me to do and on point with what I want to contribute to the community. So if you don't have an annual assessment process in place, you can use those 5 C's we talked about earlier. You can use this assessment checklist, some of the questions that your peers have answered. You can go online. I talked about BoardSource before. BoardSource, the online place, has some great resources. There's also an organization called Compass Point. Compass Point, all run together, the 2 words. They have a lot of free materials on board engagement and board assessment and board self-assessment. So you don't have to recreate the wheel. There's plenty of stuff out there you can steal from, and I'm all about that. And then just a quick note, if your board's not feeling engaged in the way that we've talked about in some of these issues, it certainly is you certainly are fully able to do that and change the board culture so it does feel more engaged. It does take time, certainly no surprise. And my practical advice, having been through this, both as a board member and a staff member for an organization, it's going to feel uncomfortable for 6 or 9 months because you'll have board members who are part of an old culture, and then you're trying to recruit board members that are part of a new culture, thinking about being more engaged, higher level volunteers, whatever the case may be. And so that transition time is going to feel messy, and it really takes a great board chair or board vice chair to manage that and sort of keep on top of where people are with the changes. And oftentimes you just have to sort of let the old board members stick with whatever they thought was working for them at the time while you get more and more people in place in your recruitment process to be involved in the board along the way. So there's some additional tips here, and certainly Iowa Council on Foundations can probably turn you on to people who are good advisors or consultants for board culture kinds of issues. So that's the end of the formal part of the presentation. Carrie passed on another question from you all, and that is, do you have any strategies to engage young people in board, young professionals, more young professionals versus youth philanthropy participants? And this is a great conversation the whole nonprofit field is having. You've got somebody who's in their 20s or early 30s. How do you engage them in the board in a way that's meaningful for them? And I'd say a couple things. One is all the studies on millennials that are out there. Many of you may have seen them before. Will say that millennials tend to want to connect with an organization more as a cause and more as a task-based kind of thing. And so it may be that for a lot of the young professionals in your community, you have to get them engaged first in a quick task, a focused weekend event, in whatever the case may be, or a task force or a committee that's not a standing, we meet monthly on Wednesday for coffee at 8 a.m. or whatever kind of thing. So it's not the way they naturally think about working in nonprofits, whether it's in a nonprofit itself or a community foundation, and then draw them in for there as they get more excited about what your mission is. And so that recruitment process of having other ways that people can be engaged before the advisory board tends to work better for the younger folks. If they do accept a board position or you are trying to make it more attractive, describing the board responsibilities in terms of very practical things. All of us need that in some ways, but especially for young professionals, because they're probably building their career and they might be building a family at the same time. Their minds stretch in a lot of different directions, and so they may need to say, okay, I know that I need to spend 2 hours with you a month thinking about these kind of things, or I know I need to make 3 calls a month. Or back to that community center that I was on the board of, when we engage young professionals, our board responsibilities was a checklist. So there were like 12 or 14 things on the checklist, and we had to check 10. That gave us some choice of, am I more comfortable going out and doing a speaking engagement, or am I more comfortable stuffing envelopes? Am I more comfortable in a group setting or an individual setting engaging people in the organization's mission? And so sometimes if you give them the choice, because millennials, all of us really love choice, but especially younger people, then they know, okay, I feel like I'm opting into something that makes sense for me and I have a choice in what this looks like versus I have to sit on the same board and do it the same way my grandpa did or my grandma did. Those are some quick tips. I will send the Iowa Council Foundation a couple other resources on engaging young professionals and young people in nonprofit boards, and they can disseminate that out to you. Any other questions that people have, feel free to chat them, put them in the chat box, or Carrie can speak them for you if you don't want to open your line up. And Betty, I'll have you unmute too. Anything else you want to say after we covered all these subjects, other ways that you've engaged your board or got your board recruited effectively?
Yeah, one thing I could add when you were talking about ambassadors, I do think that what we do with our grant liaisons is kind of like ambassadors. And the other thing it does is gives the board member an opportunity to kind of practice the elevator speech that we've come up with. A lot of times they aren't comfortable talking to people in depth about the community foundation because it is a little hard to explain in an elevator speech, and so this gives them a nice opportunity in a sort of a one-on-one situation to be able to do that.
In that ambassador role, back to the elevator speech, and we'll talk a little bit more about this next time, right? It's what you want to get out of it. It's asking questions of those folks, like, what would you want to change in the world? It's really getting them to think about their own giving preferences and their own philanthropy preferences and what makes them passionate about a community or a foreign country, whatever the case may be.
Tony, could I add one more thing? This is Betty.
Yeah. Please.
We have a couple of millennials on our board now, and one of the interesting things that is occurring is that they have a very different style and method of giving. And it's been an eye-opener, I think, for some of the older, I guess, for lack of a better word, older members on our board who think of traditional ways of giving. And it's kind of forced us to look at some different things and re-message, I guess, some of the things that when we talk about giving.
Yep.
Obviously they're much more into the online type of activity, and so something that we had not paid enough attention to, and they're kind of moving us in that direction. So it's been great to have those millennials on the board.
Good. Like I said, I'll send Carrie and Michelle some material that they can pass out to everybody. There's a lot that's been written about it. And a lot of people will give millennials a hard time because they do act differently. They actually share a number of key interests that are the same as their parents or grandparents' generation, but they maybe act on them differently because they're used to different technology access and other things. And so there's some good tips that are out there. We are 5 minutes to go. I need to turn this back over to Carrie and Michelle for some wrap-up on their end. Again, you'll be receiving the PDF. This is going to be video recorded and saved somewhere so that you can get access to it. They'll let you know. And we'll have my email here in a couple slides. So if you have any questions for me, you're happy to do that. So Carrie and Michelle.
Great. Thank you, Tony and Betty. I really appreciate your time on the webinar today and the great examples you've shared, Betty, of how things are working in a community in Iowa. So thanks again. I did want to take a couple minutes just to point out a few ICOF resources that are available in regards to advisory committee and board development. We did produce a toolkit called the Growing Together Toolkit a few years ago, and that's available in the members only section of the Iowa Community Foundation's website. If you don't have login information for that, please just send me or Michelle a note and we can get you set up for that. But there are all sorts of good resources and some board activities that you could take back to get your board thinking about these topics in that toolkit. The second thing is the colleague inquiries that we have available for our Community Foundation Network. If you have a question or need to see a sample document from other community foundations across our state, just send Michelle or I a note and we can get in touch and put that colleague inquiry out for you, collect the responses, and share those back out with the group. In addition, we have a set of DVDs that are geared towards Community Foundation board development. Most of the host community foundations have a copy of those, but if you'd need one or you'd like to see one at the affiliate level, let us know and we can connect you with that resource. And then finally, we have a variety of affiliate policy samples in the members only section as well that may be of interest as you look at fine-tuning some board policy work as you move on from this webinar and into the next. Our second webinar will be on August 10th. It's the same time, 11:30 a.m. And that, as Tony has mentioned, will focus in on your advisory committee as resource builders for your community foundation and for your community. So we hope you can join us for that. And on August 18th, we're partnering with the Council of Foundations to host a webinar on donor control, which I think is of particular interest in our state as we think about our post-affiliate relationships and how we're processing gifts for Endow Iowa. So please be sure to join us for that. I believe we've settled on the time of 1 p.m. for that, but we're still finalizing details, and we'll get that to you as soon as we can so you can get registered for that webinar as well. And there will be quite a bit of time on that webinar for Q&A. So if you have any specific questions about those things, come prepared with those, and we can ask Laura Kolinsky with the Council of Foundations those questions. As you know, Connect Conference is coming up again this fall. October 5th is the date. Tony will be joining us. So we have a great lineup of other speakers. So we hope you can mark that day on your calendar and join us in Johnston for that. And finally, we will be hosting the Community Foundations Boot Camp again this year in partnership with the Indiana Philanthropy Alliance. So that will be in the spring of 2017. We haven't focused in on the dates yet, but as soon as those are available, we will get those out to you. So wanted to make you aware of those things, and we are just at our 12:30 mark. So thank you for spending the lunch hour with us, and we will be posting a link and sharing the resources with you and follow-up communications after today. So thanks again, Tony and Betty, and all of you for joining us. Take care.
Thank you. Have a great day.